Welcome to the Brad Bodgerchuk podcast, Elizabeth Overstreet. Thank you so much for making time and being here today. I really appreciate it.
Yes, I am really happy to be on your show, Brad. Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Yeah, me as well. And I'll be really candid with you and the listeners. Elizabeth and I were actually just kind of discussing the pros and cons, if you will, from a very high level of social media. But if it wasn't for social media, I would I wouldn't have likely have been able to access someone like Elizabeth and request her time for her to come on the show. And further to that, the reason that you kind of came onto my radar is because of YouTube and that beautiful analytic beast that is. So I guess about a week ago now, I was on YouTube and YouTube suggested a video to me, and the video it suggested was a 2 minute clip of a Chris Rock bit in regards to his Netflix special, and I thought, you know what, I'll give it a shot and listen to it, and I thought it was so different from what I have heard from a lot of comedians, especially from Chris Rock, and how he spoke about relationships. And it almost sounded like he was an expert on the topic or a coach. And I was so proud of the way he approached the content. And then a few days later, I kind of went onto Google to find out more information about that bit. And your article that you wrote, or the blog that you wrote, was one of the first things that came up. And I read it and I was so intrigued by it. And I thought, hey, the least I can do is reach out to this person and see if she's willing to have a conversation. So, as much as social media can be a challenge at times, if it wasn't for social media, we wouldn't be here today. So, shout out to Instagram and YouTube and all the others because there is some upside to it.
Yeah, I think they started with good intentions, and there's a whole thing about that on Social Dilemma, and it got a little sidetracked along the way. But I do think there is power in the positive parts of how people can promote messages and promote their platform and connect with people that you normally would never come in contact with. So it is pretty cool from that perspective. So
Yeah,
glad
and
we met that way.
yeah, me as well. I'm very thankful. And before we get like into it, I say this to all my guests, Elizabeth, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart to the marrow of my bones. I believe that time is the most valuable thing that we have. So I want to thank you for giving me and the listener yours today. I really do appreciate it.
No, you're welcome. Like I said, I'm always excited to talk about relationships. So I probably shouldn't put that out there in the spectrum, but I typically don't turn down an opportunity to discuss it because it's just my passion, and I want to help people get it right. And I just enjoy learning too from the people that I get to meet and interact with and have these discussions. So thanks again for inviting me here.
Yeah, my pleasure. I think that's a great segue as well. Something that you just said, and perhaps consciously, maybe unconsciously, but you said, I want to help people get it right. So, um, I'm guessing that people are getting it wrong, or they're coming to you and saying, like, hey, I've been getting it wrong. So, in your words, and I'm assuming, but these are my words, I'm assuming it's a case by case scenario, but in your experience with your clients that you work with, how have they been getting it wrong? How have we, as a society, been getting it wrong?
I think there's two ways to answer this question. I think that now we are very aware of different psychological terminology like gaslighting, ghosting, post-traumatic stress that comes from being in an unhealthy relationship, toxic relationships. But I think what we're getting wrong is sometimes just the things that are just clearly in front of us, like overthinking our relationships, making them a lot more complex than they need to be, not using all of the anecdotal information that's out there of relationships that are successful or information that's available about how to have a successful relationship. And I think the reason there's that gap is because people learn about their relationships through what they observe or what's modeled for them.
Mm.
So most of the time in every relationship, there's some level of dysfunction. But then there's that spectrum, right, where there could be a lot of dysfunction. So I think it's not something that is because people are stupid or don't get it. I
Mm.
just think it's the one thing we just kind of fall into a little more haphazardly, and it's our approach isn't as strategic as, like, say, going to get a degree or going to start a business or even planning a trip that we may spend a year planning, right,
Mm.
with all the details. But when it comes to a relationship, we're just kind of like, well, this person, it seems like it's right, let's go for it. And we don't take that same energy and investment of time and resources to really vet out that person, and then we become disappointed when it doesn't work.
So is that part of your work then? Are you kind of like a strategic partner in helping, say you're working with let's just say a heterosexual male who isn't having any luck in the dating game. Are you creating like a strategic process for him to one like define, okay, who is his ultimate vision as a partner, and then kind of looking at, okay, well, how should you be showing up in your life to attract someone like that? Or is your approach different? You're not taking them through the steps. How does
So
your
I'm approach it has a different, so I'm a relationship coach and expert, and I think what's different about how I would approach it is the counselor is going to do it from a methodology. They
Mhm.
can't really talk about their personal experiences or other people's anecdotal experiences. So I'm bringing my experiences and others experiences and my coaching experiences to help people come up with a plan. And I do one of my ways that I coach, I term myself as a love strategist, because I do think there should be not an over thought out strategic approach to love, because love is a natural thing that happens, and a lot of times we don't even understand why we love the person we love, because there's intangible factors. I don't think you could plan it to that degree, but I do think you can be intentional about having self-awareness around what your cycles are
Mhm.
that create negative dynamics in your relationships, or why you may have had failures before. So it's always like fun for me to engage with the person first, because I really believe the foundation starts with you. That's
Mhm.
the only controllable factor. And then everyone is like an outlier of that. And so if you can get the person to figure out who they are and to be strong in who they are, confident, understand, have self-awareness of where their gaps are, it's much easier to help them get to the right partner. But I
Right.
think if you don't have that self-awareness, you can have all the right people in your life, because you hear these stories all the time, but it's so temporary because you're still not dealing with the parts of yourself that you need to correct, which is a continuous improvement cycle, which is very hard for people because they kind of want to do a one and done. But
Mhm.
we change and we morph as humans, so it's a constant process of
Yeah,
self
that
awareness.
yeah, that resonates a lot with me, and I know that's one thing we haven't had an opportunity to speak about it yet, but we both share in common is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we've both been married and have gone through divorces, have kind of refound love. I now have my partner, who's the mother of our two children, and I'm madly in love with her. And I've said since kind of day one, it's almost like I feel like I've almost built her in a lab. Like she's that good for me.
That's
Obviously,
awesome.
she's not perfect because there is no such thing, nor am I.
That's
We
right.
have our flaws, but I feel so lucky and so blessed, as challenging as that my divorce was and that relationship was, and seeing the damage that it had on not only my life and her life, but also the people in our circle as well, how it affected them, which I found was a really unique and interesting kind of like sociological experiment as well, and seeing how invested people were in relationship, not so much when things seemed okay, but when things weren't okay, everyone now had vested interest, which I thought was a really interesting, again, like a
Yeah, and people tell you all
sociological.
these things that they should have probably told you at the beginning of the
Yeah,
relationship. And
yeah.
that is the most frustrating part, because you're like, you saw this and why didn't you say anything? And because of course when you're not close to something, you just have a better lens of it. Like
Hmm.
our friends can come to us for advice and we can usually pretty easily give them good solutions because we're not as close to it. But when it comes to ourselves, we're just too close to ourselves to
Hmm.
see things, right? So I always find that to be interesting too, that people afterwards like, yeah, I kind of saw some things. And you're like, you could have told me that 8 years ago. That would have saved me a little time. But it's like people are like, I didn't want to mess up your happiness, and I'm like, next time, just chime in. I want to hear about it.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Something that you mentioned just in regards to like that inner work, that like self-awareness piece. I'm guessing that I haven't read your book yet, but I will be ordering it. It's available on Amazon, guys, and it's called "Love You and He Will
yeah,
Too." Oh, shout out! There it is. I like it.
yeah.
So is a lot of your work then that you do with your clients? You are saying that you're a relationship expert, but within the relationship, there's dynamics of individuals as well. So are you helping people? And again, feel free to paraphrase what I'm saying, but are you helping people work with like their inner child a bit, and their inner, like their love for themselves? Because not to get too Freudian here, but I'm a big believer that like hurt people hurt people.
Absolutely.
Do you dive into that with your clients as well, or
Yeah,
is it a little more like surface?
no, we go deep, and it's uncomfortable sometimes. But I think in order to get real with yourself, you have to be uncomfortable. And a lot of people talk about self-love and they throw it out there. I'm all about self-love. I love myself. I care for myself. And my thing is like, that's cool, but part of self-love is also self-accountability.
Hmm.
So in each relationship, I always say, I love this one quote. you are 50% of the problem and 100% of the solution.
Mm.
So no matter what, you are always empowered to make a decision to get away from a negative situation. You're 100% of the solution, and you're 100% of the solution because you can control your narrative always.
Mm-hmm.
And you're always part of the equation. As much as people say, well, it was the other person's fault, and we have extremes of that, but you were still in that relationship. So there has to be accountability of where you need to like kind of recalibrate yourself. Otherwise, you keep repeating the same thing over and over. So yeah, we go very deep into like childhood, how people observe relationships, what type of people they choose, because it's very interesting. A lot of people don't always see the connection of the patterns of who they choose based on how they grew up and what they observed in their parents' relationship or their grandparents or whoever may have raised them. And it's so subliminal that it's very hard to like fight. And even when you are aware of it, on some level, you are going to be attracted to, and it seems weird, your parents, because that's what you know and understand. So I think the key is just like getting rid of the like negative aspects, right? Like if there was a parent that was had like alcohol abuse, say they had or drug dependency, that we make sure that you're aware that you may have a tendency to be in relationships where you have to rescue people. And you may not even know why, because maybe you were the kid that took care of that parent that had that particular issue. But let's try to dig into like how we change that, and how when someone comes along that you don't have to rescue or who doesn't look so broken, how that person can also be appealing to you, because there's a lot of that happens as well with people.
Yeah, I find that so intriguing dynamically as we work with individuals. And I had that challenge with a client a while ago where I was speaking with my mentor and I was saying like they don't want to do the work. Like we're laying out the plan, we're executing as far as I'm concerned, but there just hasn't been a change. And like, what do you do in those moments? And he said something, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, but he said like, do you always want to work with people that are broken? And I don't, but I looking back at my patterns through my career, but also my patterns with people that I chose as my mates, I was constantly seeking for me to be the rescuer. And I had to feel like I could help them in some way.
Right.
This is going like deep, deep into, again, my childhood, because I felt if I couldn't give something to them and help them, that I wasn't going to be needed or valued or kept around. And that for me, like brings up a bunch of emotions from my childhood and what I experienced. But it's interesting that you are open to, and do facilitate that for your clients, because I think it is so valuable for us to, it's kind of a used term right now, but like take off our masks a bit and go within and be like, okay, how is this showing up within my relationship now, or how has it showed up in the past, and is it allowing me to be successful, or is it really holding me back from having those deeper connections and really being fulfilled? It's just so intriguing. I'm assuming with your work, with working with so many different people, you find so many different case studies, so many different past experiences.
We're so much more alike than we think.
I was just gonna say,
We are like,
yeah.
it's amazing. Even between men and women, there's so much that's more similar than different. We may communicate it differently and we may express it differently, but so much is the same feelings that we have. We're all human, and we are built and made up of our collective experiences, to your point. So I've dated guys like similar to what you're talking about, where before I was married, because I'm married now, I want to put that out there, that like they would tell me, I don't know how you're not making me feel needed. I need to feel needed. And sometimes you feel like as a woman, like, why are you being so needy or clingy, right? If you're a type A personality or you're achievement oriented type of woman, you're like, why does this guy feel like he has to, like, can't he figure that out? But then I think the follow-up question is, what makes you feel that way? Where did that come from? And kind of digging into that with that person, because unfortunately for that guy who has had to maybe take care of a parent who had an issue, or maybe who had a mom that left or a dad that left, in their mind, they're always like, how can I help? Because they want to prevent that situation in a way in their current relationships. It's like they're reliving some of their traumas or their gaps, right, for their childhood. So I think when you dig into it, you have a better understanding of it, and that's how couples can kind of come together. But it's so hard because there's so much that we have in our mind that we don't always communicate to our partner. We make assumptions, we walk away from discussions feeling certain ways, and not really digging into like, well, why did that person react that way, and trying to get more clarity on it. And I think those are the reasons I think too that some relationships don't last, right? Because it's just like people just shut down. Because and I always use the analogy, like in my book, of how your parents know you pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
If you were raised by both of your parents, one of your parents, they pretty much know your temperament and who you are. But there's still things they don't know about you, and they're your parents, so they're pretty much the closest person. Your mom carried you in her womb,
Mm-hmm.
and she still doesn't know everything about you. You haven't told her everything that you've done, right? But she has a good sense of it. But then we get in a relationship with someone and we're like, we assume they should figure things out really quickly, and it's not a fair assumption, and it's not a fair process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so important. It's so important to be sensitive to that, but also if you're able to yourself as the person be willing to open up and share that, and through that, as you work through it, the growth is just it's incredible. And you said it yourself, like there is some I believe for there to be growth, there has to be some pain and
there has to be discomfort. Yeah, some
discomfort.
level of discomfort.
Exactly.
It shouldn't hurt all the time, but there's going to be
Right.
some discomfort. And I think that's what people get afraid of, and they look for excuses to escape that discomfort. But I
Mm-hmm.
think part of a relationship, even if you have children, they go through different stages. And I always say this, like, every time your child changes, it's an adjustment for you too. It's an
Mm-hmm.
adjustment for the child, but then it's an adjustment for you. It's an adjustment on the dynamic of your relationship. So now you're bringing a whole human being who's a grown human being with their own collective experiences. They're, as humans, we're constantly evolving. We're different from our 20s to our 30s
Mm-hmm.
to our 40s, and as we age, because we have different experiences. So we really got to give each other grace, on some
Yeah.
level, to seek to understand versus making assumptions, because assumptions really could get you in trouble, right? And
Yeah.
behind the eight ball with your relationship.
Yeah, that understanding piece is key, and I've heard that as far as kind of advice from others in the field, stating things like you need to be able to articulate back to your partner what they are trying to communicate to you before you can really move forward. If you're not able to do that, so they feel fully heard, it's going to be kind of a standstill. I think that's the beautiful thing and the frustrating thing about relationships is they will never be easy. Why? Because there's two brains.
It's two
And
people.
like we were
Yeah.
talking about, like two different experiences, like childhood traumas, some more severe than others, high school dating, all these things. You come together and I see things that you don't see. You see things that I don't see. And, it's,
And it's building that bridge, so eventually it becomes like complementary, because then it's like,
mm-hmm,
man, you're going to look at it this way, I'm going to look at it that way. I appreciate that you have this difference.
mm-hmm,
And I think a lot of the reasons that couples, have disagreements, and it gets like, it festers and it gets worse, is because people don't validate people's feelings.
mm-hmm.
Like, there's nothing like, when you ask a couple about an argument, it's very interesting how they will express the argument. And a lot of times it's like, he didn't understand. It felt like he wasn't understanding how I felt, or it felt like she didn't appreciate what I did.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and if you think about all of those terms, it's really validation. We really seek this validation in our partners, and if we don't get it, that's what I think too can like create, the issues. And that's why I go back, going back to your point, you're right. That communication piece is key. Being able to like really verbalize back to your partner, is this what you're saying? Is this what you're expressing? And also being clear on what you want, because sometimes people will say, well, they're not giving me what I want. But if you ask them even succinctly, what do you really want in this relationship? Sometimes they don't know. So that's that self-love piece. You got to build your foundation first, understand what's important to you, understand what your needs are, to be able to even articulate it to your partner. Because if they get it wrong, that's not on them. That's on you as well.
Yeah, totally. And that's something I'm learning as a father as well, and as a coach is and I'm going to try my best to explain this. If say our daughter, who's just like kind of officially potty trained, which is amazing and I love it and it's awesome, no more diapers, yay, high five. But through that process, it was on myself and Lindsay, my partner. If she wasn't understanding us, it wasn't that we had to either like yell or shout. It was we had to learn to communicate how she learns. She didn't need to learn how we communicated. Does that make sense? So we need to adjust our communication to how our partners learn,
Yes.
not how like,
Yes.
hey, get on my page. Like this is what you. Like, why does this not make sense to you? Well, because you're a
Right.
different person, so you
And
have to
don't
learn.
insult them like, well, this is
Hmm.
common sense, because it may not be common sense in the way they're thinking about it. And
Hmm.
you said something really important about your daughter. Like, I think when it comes to children, there's an important lesson, and it's a lesson that can be applied to relationships. When your kid may grow up one day and be like, you might be like, I provide this great life for my kid. I gave him this, I did this. And you may ask that kid, like, well, what did you think about your experience of growing up with me? And they'll say, well, this was great, but I wish you could have spent more time, or I wish you would have been more affectionate. And so I think it's a natural instinct as a parent and humans in general to lean into what we want and
Hmm.
express that to the other person, whether it's our kids or our partner. But it's so important to understand like how they want it to be received. And
Hmm.
so you have a lot of kids sometimes that grow up, right, where the parents are like, I did all this, I put them in private school, I did this, and the
Hmm.
kid is like, I really didn't care about that, I just wanted time with you.
Hmm.
And I always find that to be so interesting, but it's a natural thing that we do, because we're like, well, I would have wanted my parents to give me this experience or to do this, so we assume our kid wants it. And I think we do it with our partners too. And I know you're familiar with the love languages and like,
Hmm.
being aware of your partner's love language, but I think there's even another layer there, that just because someone isn't expressing something the way you would want them to, you have to kind of appreciate that they're doing it from a place of love,
Hmm.
because it's the way they're comfortable. And I think it takes time to get them to be comfortable expressing it in different ways. And you may find you start to like some of the ways to express it. So there's that part of it too. But it just goes back to my point that you really got to be clear and understand your partner, and,
Hmm.
and communicate with them about like, okay, how do you like to be communicated to? How, when we're having a disagreement, what is the best way? If it gets heated, how do we kind of
Hmm.
resolve quickly?
Hmm.
Because that's another telltale sign of a success of a relationship, how quickly you can reconcile, after a disagreement, because you're fighting the problem, not each other,
Right. And that's
which
something
gets
that,
lost.
yeah, for sure. That's something that I just am learning right now. Like I posted and I saw that you double tapped and liked it. Thank you so much on Instagram. That ratio, I don't know if you follow or read
I
any of
saw that.
John
Yeah.
Gottman's studies, but I'm just so intrigued by the science and the study that he's done. So the 5-to-1 ratio that he has found is couples when they're in a disagreement, when they're actually in, let's just say a fight for lack of a better term, successful couples, happy couples, are still experiencing 5 pleasurable moments outweighed to the 1 negative moment. And then he said, outside of those arguments, those couples are experiencing like 20-to-1, like they're finding 20 fulfilling and happy things and only 1 negative thing. The reason I wanted to bring that up is the work that you have done. Have you been able to? Obviously, you wouldn't do this in a session with clients, but are you at the point now in your career where you can sit down with a couple and you can tell within, you know, a first few minutes or a couple, like the first few meetings, whether or not this couple is going to succeed? Or do you still kind of let the process happen and you try not to let your like judgmental mind come into it? Or are you like, whoa guys, you don't say this, but like you guys are in a lot of
You're
trouble?
done. You're done.
Yeah.
You're done. No, I do try to just go through the process, because people can surprise you. But sometimes, yes, I do have an inkling. Like, if it's very unilateral, meaning there's only one person working hard at it, invested in it, then to me, that's kind of a telltale sign it might not work. Also, I listen to like clues, and you can kind of tell when people are holding on to things. And I feel like people go through things, infidelity, maybe there's financial things that happen, they made bad decisions. At a certain point, it's hard, but you got to let it go and move forward. And I've counseled couples where you can tell that they're still holding on. And so that stuff I think is damaging in the long term. And I think
Hmm.
it could increase their chances of not working, because I think the more you're holding on to stuff, you can't really connect with the person. And we feel it as humans. We feel when our partners are
Hmm.
connecting to us, and we feel when they're distant. So to answer your question, I try not to judge, but of course I can't help but not to like pay attention, because I wouldn't be good at what I do.
Right.
So I am observing and paying attention, and I do sometimes have an instinct, but sometimes I've been proven wrong. And so I
Hmm.
don't express that. I just kind of watch the process, because sometimes people may need to hear something and hear it repeatedly and really process it and think about it from a different lens, or have someone in the room that's subjective, that's not their partner, right, telling them similar things, and they
Hmm.
may hear it differently than their partner expressing it to them. So you just never know.
Yeah,
People
it's
are
true.
unpredictable.
Very, and life is as well.
Mhm.
One thing I'm really intrigued by in this whole process of diving deeper into relationships and communication, understand just how we as humans interact, especially within the dynamics of a relationship. I'm so intrigued by how we, and this is a general statement, but, and I think especially true for men, unfortunately, we won't seek help until like we really, really need it.
When you really need it. Yeah. Like when
And
everything's falling apart.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I feel like that's
Yeah.
true for a lot of us in North America with our relationships. But as someone who facilitates, people dealing with these issues and moving through and exercising, and if someone is thinking like, hey, I would love to potentially work with Elizabeth, they don't need to have issues, right? They can come to you and be more like preventative medicine, if you will.
Right. I feel like, even when we look at our healthcare landscape, right? It's a lot of things we can do preventatively. We know if we eat healthy, that's going to help our health. We know if we work out, that's going to help our heart. That's going to help our heart health, which common sense says if you have a good heart, you can live a pretty long life, right? And so I think the same thing with relationships. I don't think you have to wait till you're in trouble or you feel like you need to solve through something right away. You could be proactive in understanding what type of relationship would be the right relationship with you, talking with someone to coach you through that, or trying to build up your own self-esteem, because maybe you have come through what I call relationship PTSD,
Mhm.
which is understandable. So yeah, I think you could totally be proactive. And I think if more people were proactive versus reactive, we wouldn't have such the fallout of divorce and
Mhm.
the infidelity and the other issues that trickle in when people are not really content with themselves. And
Mhm.
it just unfortunately appears in the relationship, right? And affects the relationship.
In your opinion, though, what is that driver? What is the? I guess it's not a driver. It's the opposite, the antithesis of a driver. It's a stopper. But what is that hesitation? Do you think? Again, we're generally speaking here about the population.
Yeah.
Is it is
It's
it
funny.
a is it a
Go
sorry?
ahead.
Is it a working with a therapist or working with a counselor or working with a coach can be seen as almost like a crutch or a weakness. Is that part of it? Or is it just we don't want to admit we need help, or we have just, like you were saying, the relationships we've had modeled for us, we never saw our parents, like my parents going to counseling, like heck no, like definitely not.
Yeah.
Should they?
I think it's like,
100%.
yeah, I think it's all those factors. I think we are normalizing mental health. Ironically, one of the good parts of COVID is that people realized that they were pacifying a lot of their emotional issues by being able to not deal with them directly. And COVID really put people, it forced people to really face head on some of their challenges, right?
Mhm.
Internally, mentally. And I think that has taken some of the stigma away. Like mental health is like huge right now. But going back to your point about men and maybe why men are more reactive is because men are problem solvers. And sometimes I think they just wait to, if it keeps building and then they try to solve that problem hard. And I think sometimes the intentions are actually good, but the damage has been done, right? And so it's hard for them to come back from it. And it's another thing I was listening to earlier. When men come in the world as young boys, they are open and able to be, emotional or whatever.
Mhm.
But then there's always someone that kind of shuts that down. You're a man. You got to hold it in. You got to be tough.
Mhm.
And some of that is true because the world is hard, right? Harder on boys in some ways than women. But at the same time, what it does foster is a lot of fear of like opening up and being emotionally vulnerable. Uh, Understand what intimacy really is, as far as the
Mhm.
communication, the things that happen before you reach the bedroom, right? Um, just communicating through challenges. And so, to your point, I think it's almost like with men, women actually, and my husband talks about this all the time. He said, "You guys find a way to vent. Like
Mhm.
you talk to each other, you get it out." He
Mhm.
said, whereas for men, we don't, that's not our norm. Like we may get together, watch sports, but we don't go deep too much. So he's like, we're holding all of that in. And he's like, you guys are releasing it. And that's
Mhm.
actually smart. It's like it's almost like you have a support group of friends. He said, I have to get better at that. So I think it's really ingrained through how how little boys are raised
Mhm.
and then how they become men. And then those same things are there that have been like just bottled up
Yeah,
for years.
it's so interesting, and we really are just um, you know mirroring our childhood experiences. And I heard someone the other day speaking about if you looked at a playground interaction, all of the little girls would be like face to face and like playing and looking at each other and acknowledging each other, whereas the boys are all running around and there's very little eye contact. And if someone falls, it's like, oh, like get up, dust off your knee, and keep going.
That's true.
Whereas the girls, it's innate. And again, this is a general sweeping statement, and
Right,
there'll
right.
be different experiences. But I thought that was such a unique. point of view, and so appropriately stated that as I look back on my experiences on playgrounds, that very much was the case. The girls were always kind of huddled up in like little, their pods of friends and interacting with each other, where the boys were, there was very little physical touch or contact, not even really recognizing each other or seeing each other, if you will, and just kind of staying in their own worlds. But to your point, I do think COVID, I do think the fact that it's 2021 now, we're seeing that change. And I think it's conversations like this, it's through books like you've written, and your podcast is Bed Talks, right?
It is, yes,
Yeah, like
yes.
podcasts like yours. I think it's beginning to normalize a bit the male emotional process. And for so long, as it's been told to me, and I think it's really appropriate, really accurate, is for so long the men in our world have been told they can only feel glad, mad, and sad. Those are the three.
Right.
But now we're able to, through work like you do and your peers, is to give them a space to be able to feel and express those spectrum of emotions. And through that, then they live a more, I think, a more exciting, fulfilled life, and a love life, especially.
Yeah, and I feel, I was just interviewing a guy who's a doctor who deals with a lot of therapy with men. He said for men, there's like two emotions that they can pretty much demonstrate and that are acceptable, and they are anger and indifference.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, that's such like an extreme variation of emotions, anger or indifference. So it's like kind of like I don't give a crap or anger.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've been, for women out there in a relationship with a man, you've seen those emotions demonstrated. You're like, okay, it just seems like he doesn't care, or he's angry. Where is that coming from? So
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right. The fact that we're normalizing it now is such a good thing, that men are seeking out therapy because there's so much that they're holding inside. And I think of another example, someone I knew, where he told me, he's like, I never cried except once in my life. And I said, well, when was that? And he was like, well, when his grandmother, who really raised him, when she died, he said that was the only time I broke down. And I was like, wow. I'm like, you must have so much inside of you. And I knew this person, and I would see them express these ranges of anger. And all I could think was like, you need to like release.
Mm-hmm.
But in his mind, he felt like he was strong
Mm-hmm.
because he didn't express his emotion only in that one acceptable, in his mind, acceptable way. And
Mm-hmm.
so that, I don't think that story is that uncommon. That track is that uncommon for boys who may have had to grow up quicker, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe grew up with a single mom, who had to take on roles where they were more in a father figure in a strange way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they had to just kind of man up. I could see how these things could just build over time.
It's amazing how much culture impacts that, especially, I mean, in all of us in our relationships. So I'm just thinking as you say that, like, maybe there has to be studies on this, but like racially, is it more acceptable for, like heterosexual white males to be more emotional than black heterosexual males, or Hispanic like there's a lot of cultural
There
issues,
is, right? That's
stigmas
a good
that we're
point.
dealing with, right? That we have to be
Yeah.
sensitive to. But
because
again,
because yeah, because for people of color, I mean, to be honest, I don't think going to get mental help was like a thing that was talked
mhm,
about. There
mhm,
were people who definitely you may have been around and you knew something was off, but they just saw that person's a little different. Like, people didn't really address it head on. I see that shifting, and I see the pendulum swinging the other way.
mhm,
And I know it may feel extreme to people who are like more mature, but I think the pendulum does that on purpose, because you got to get people here and then they'll come back to the middle, because you got to get people expressing and comfortable doing so. So I do see that change, to your point, of where, like, I grew up with really diverse friends, and in some cultural settings it was totally acceptable to be like, yes, so and so had to go see a shrink,
right,
or so
right.
and so is going for counseling, and you're like, huh? And in other circles, it was like no one talked about those things, but they
Mhm.
were definitely things that still needed to be addressed.
And not even quote unquote extreme things like that. Like, even like if you never saw your friend hug or kiss their parents, or things like, all of these
Right.
things are just will be carried through, I feel, in and will show up in that person's ability or their desire to, be emotional and share emotions. I think we could do like an 8-hour podcast on just that, but I want to change speeds just for a minute. I think everyone's favorite topic when it comes to relationships is sex. Where does sex in a relationship for you land as far as the priority sequence? Is it, like, sex is number one, everything else follows through, or like how important is that, and how much do you encourage or even do you ask with your clients, like, how often are they intimate, and how important is that to forging like a deeper connection for people as they go through a relationship?
I think it depends on the couple and their relationship dynamics. So for me, my philosophy is really, it depends. I think each relationship has its own dynamics and different things are important to different couples. So for some people, sex could be like really high because they're like, I have a very strong sex drive.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I connect with the person. If I don't feel like the chemistry's there, I can't get behind the other aspects of the relationship. And I think sex is important in that situation. Like, I think that they should rank it pretty high, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it should be the number one thing. But I do think they should be with someone that they're attracted to or they feel a physical connection with and there's chemistry,
Mm-hmm.
because you can't fake those things. Those are like intangibles. And I do think people have even sex love languages, and it's a more formal term for it. I can't think of what it is right now, but
Mm-hmm.
different people like to express sex different. Some people are more foreplay, some people are more in the moment, some people are more adventurous. And I do think that compatibility is important. Like, if you're someone who's very sexually open and you're experimental and you get with someone who's super conservative, yeah, you're going to teach them some things, but you might get frustrated
Mm-hmm.
realistically if they're not open to like embracing new experiences. So I really think it depends on the couple, but I do think outside the sex lens, just the chemistry is important, the attraction, because you already are going to be in a relationship with someone where it's going to be hard. You're going to have some moments where it's difficult. You might get lucky. I mean, I met I would say like 5% of my couples, there's a genuine love there, genuine attraction. You could just tell they have a great friendship. They've started off together and they've been fortunate enough to keep that momentum, but that is not always the norm that I've observed.
Mm-hmm.
So if you start off and you don't have like similar sexual chemistry, that's hard, because the sexual chemistry, I feel like, is what can enhance or get you through some of the
Mm-hmm.
other patches, right? Because sex is just not just sex. Sex is like how people connect, how they interact, how they express, how they reconcile through some things, right? Healthy sometimes and not healthy in other ways, right? But
Mm-hmm.
to me, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
But I do think you can't overrate it either, because sex is also just one component of a relationship. And
Mm-hmm.
you could have great sex with someone, but they might not be a good person to be in a relationship with too. So there's
Right.
that extreme too. But you could just have amazing chemistry in
Mm-hmm.
bed, but not be able to really communicate well, or not really have a lot of common interest in it. And I don't think the sex can sustain against those other factors,
Yeah,
even great sex.
I would tend to agree. That scenario kind of reminds me of, and again, is kind of a great segue into getting your take on this like polyamorous lifestyle that we're seeing. I mean, it's been around forever.
Forever, yeah.
And people have been, as far as I know, there was like cavemen and cavewomen, like groups that would just like,
Doing their thing.
one caveman would have like five wives, one caveman would have zero. But do you feel, or sorry, I guess first and foremost, have you dealt with couples as a relationship expert that are experimenting or that are living the reality of open relationship, and then how does that
Yeah,
play out?
I've given advice and talked to some people who do have open relationships. And I think that if you decide to go down that route, it needs to be something that both parties agree on.
Hmm.
There has to be like set rules of engagement, because otherwise it could create rifts or issues, right, in your relationship. And sometimes people in polyamorous relationships, I'm not a fan of a polyamorous relationship
Hmm.
personally, but sometimes it works for some people because they are experimental, like we just talked about.
Hmm.
They may want the consistency of a partner or a set of partners, but they may want sexual experiences, and they may be okay with that, and their partner may be okay with that. And sometimes people in those relationships actually have more open communication, because
Right.
they're like expressing, I have this need that's being unmet. Whereas I think sometimes people in like a relationship with just one person, we know that could be such a difficult conversation to navigate, because people are highly sensitive about their sexual performance. They just are.
Hmm.
So I think the thing that polyamorous relationships could have that are an advantage is that I feel like there's more transparency around that from the people I've coached and talked to.
Hmm. Yeah, I find it again. It's I'm not going to throw shade at it. It's not my personal choice.
Right. It's a lot
I've
of work for
always,
me. I feel like
yeah,
I'm busy with my one. So for me, I would
yeah,
be like, man, I
exactly.
gotta do it. But for some people I mean, and that goes back to my theory that it depends on what the people want that are in the
Hmm.
relationship.
Hmm.
Each dynamic, you got to do what works for you and your partner. And I think as soon as you try to compare or be like someone else, that's when you lose, because that's not being genuine to who you and your partner are. So you guys have different needs, and say, Bob and Sue over here, Bob and Sue may want to run off and do the polyamorous thing, and that might be their thing, and it may work for them. But then John and Rachel over here, they may like the monogamy. They may like a certain set type of lifestyle, more like stable, low key, traditional, I should say, lifestyle. So you have to do what works for the two of you.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. I do want to respect your time, but I'm not ready to let you go quite yet. But before I do let you get on with your afternoon, I want to learn from you like 3 or 5 of the new rules of dating. So this is your Instagram handle, yes, New Rules of Dating, right? And your website, correct?
Yes.
So I'm intrigued. Obviously, I'm in a committed relationship. I'm madly in love, and she's the mother of my 2 kids. So I'm not looking to get back into the dating game. But there's a lot of people out there that are trying to navigate the world, and it is, as far as I'm concerned, more competitive, and there's more choice, and it's more challenging than it ever has been. So, from you, Elizabeth, what would be like your top 3 or top 5 of the new rules of dating?
I'll give you 3.
Okay.
So number 1, be realistic about your expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And some of this is taken from my book that I wrote. I think that we sometimes have these expectations of what this other person should be. And then I think it's important to look in the mirror and make sure you are bringing to the table the similar expectations of what you want in return. Right. I'm not saying aim low. I'm just saying position yourself so that you are the catch as well. Mm-hmm. And realistic means understand people are human. No one's perfect. Look for attributes that are more long lasting, because I think there's certain attributes that can be fleeting, and there's certain attributes that are more long lasting. So more long lasting attributes is someone that just has stability, or they're consistent, or they have empathy, or they have compassion. They're thoughtful. They're loyal. Those are, to me, more long-lasting attributes. Being too caught up in what someone brings to the table, which I get is important on a certain level, but putting that so high that you circumvent the other qualities can leave you in a relationship where I've coached so many people. They're with someone and they have what looks like the outer trappings of a great life, but they're in a house not talking to each other, not sleeping with each other, not even in the same room. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying you can't have your dream girl or guy that gives you that, but just be balanced with looking at the other attributes as well.
Yeah.
So being more realistic.
And any others?
Yeah. I say stop being so damn picky.
I like that.
No one is perfect, not even you. Mm-hmm. You're right. It does appear like we have more options, because you go online, you can go to OkCupid, you can go to Bumble, you can go to Tinder, yeah. And you can just keep going, and keep doing the quantity thing and keep trading people out. But people are people, and the thing that you still may find is this pattern of you not dealing with you, which is why you keep picking another person and thinking, okay, I can change this, because I can't remember. My mind, it's escaping me right now. But when you go through the cycles of relationships, it's these different stages, right? Mm-hmm. And the first stage is really that honeymoon stage. Mm-hmm. And then there's a stage where you become aware of your partner. And it's oh, you may wake up and be like, did I get with this person? Did I make this decision? But that's the first real day of your relationship. I heard that quote. That's kind of true, because that's the test that you realize now this person isn't perfect. You're not perfect, but are you willing to stick with it and see where it can lead? Are you willing to work with them? So I think it's important. Don't be so damn picky, because a lot of times when you're too picky, you miss out on opportunities. Love doesn't always come in the shape or look that we think it will. So you got to be open-minded, but again, doing the foundational work on yourself.
Yeah, so key. And do you have a third for us?
Yeah, I think, we talked about being proactive about our relationship problems. I think that's a good one, but find healthy relationships to model. There's a lot of best practices around love and relationships. And I think we could love smarter, not harder, because we know what unhealthy looks like. I feel like a lot of us know that, but do we know what healthy looks like? And do we know how to cultivate healthy? Do we know couples who can give us insights? And of course, you never know what's happening between, this is my caveat, two people, because people don't always disclose everything. But there are people usually around you that seem to have a pretty good dynamic that you can glean some things from, even if you came up in a rough childhood, even if your parents were divorced, or even if you never saw like a healthy relationship. So I think when you get that in your mind as you're dating, you then know what to look for, and don't overthink it. Because like I feel like people, they overthink their intuition. They feel things, but they ignore what they feel. And I think, think with your heart and your mind. I always say, like, your heart is going to give you the warm and gushy feelings, which is important because that's
Hmm.
your intangible, your attraction. But your mind is also going to be there, like, wait a minute, slow down. Something's off here. You gotta like align both of them together. So I think just leaning into that, like a lot of questions people ask me a lot of times or come to me for, they already know the answer, but they're
Right.
waiting for validation. Like, this person's been ignoring me, and do you think they're just really busy? No.
Right. They're just
They
ignoring you.
like, right, they're just ignoring you. And we know this, but sometimes we want to fight so hard for
Hmm.
what's outside of our norm. And then I would say one final rule is realize that a healthy relationship will feel so much different than when you've been in an unhealthy relationship. And that
Hmm.
may be your hardest relationship, because
Hmm.
when you're not fighting or having like disagreements, or you're not knowing how to communicate, or the person's playing hard to get and they're not communicating with you consistently, that may feel more comfortable almost, because that's kind of the signals we get from movies, that when a guy hits you on the playground, he likes you, or when
Hmm.
he ignored you, that he just must, he wants you. You just got to work a little harder for it. And in reality, when you like someone and they like you, things just align in a,
Hmm.
in a nice natural way. It's not forced, it happens. And there's not those like feelings of like, do they like me, do they care? Because when a person likes you, they're constantly wanting to reaffirm it to you. They
Right.
want you to know, because they're in it. So that's my other thing, just not like misthinking,
Hmm.
that in your mind, or overthinking it, or
Yeah. Overthinking.
overcomplicating it.
Those are great. Those are great tips, and I appreciate that. Before I do let you go officially, if people do want to reach out, obviously, Bed Talks, the podcast, they can check that out through your website, which is the new rules of dating, correct?
Dating, yeah,
Yep.
yep, the new rules of dating, or they can go to elizabethoverstreet.com, either one.
Okay.
They're linked together. So my podcast is there, and then links to all my social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and I just love helping people find love. It's the most rewarding thing I do.
Yeah.
And
Heck yeah.
each time I'm like, am I on the right path? Someone reaches out and gives me just a phenomenal message of encouragement, unsolicited,
Hmm.
like, no, this really helped me. And for me, that just gives me like, it makes me feel good, because I don't want people to have to like wait a long time to figure out things when the answers are there. I don't want them to have to go through some of the things, which that's a whole nother show, Brad, of like what I've
Yeah.
had to go through to
Yeah,
figure
for
out things.
sure.
I want to cut your learning down. So
Hmm.
it makes me feel very good to give back to people something that really can affect their life in such a positive way.
No, that's beautiful, and I can get that from you in just our last 53 minutes together, that you are truly a sincere person, and I want to say thank you again for your time. And guys, the book is called "Love You and He Will Too," correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, so you can get that online also through Elizabeth's website. Thank you so much. It was
Thank you
enlightening. It
too.
was educational. It was super fun. I love meeting new people. And I really do want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come onto my podcast and share what you do and what you know. It means a lot to me. So thank you again so much.
No problem. You're welcome. And I enjoyed our time, and I learned from you too. I always like coming on these shows too, because it's like I learn as well. And I could talk about relationships forever. I could wear
Yeah,
people out with it.
no, not at all. Okay, guys, that is it. That is Elizabeth. I am Brad. This is the Brad Bondarchuk podcast. I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in as you do week after week. If it wasn't for you, this show wouldn't exist. You guys know what to do until next time. Be good and do good. That's it. We did it.
Yeah, we did it. Thank you. That was
Thank you.
fun.
Thank you so much.